Welcome to class. Before we begin, let me be clear about the purpose of this subunit. This part is about understanding mechanism. It is not about judging individuals' intentions. We are not here to label people as ethical or unethical, nor we are trying to assign blames to specific actors. Instead, we are asking a structural question. If the ideal ethical models of authorship is relatively clear, why does it so often fail to hold in practice? This opening set the tone for what follows. We are shifting our attention away from individual morality and toward the conditions that shape behavior. By doing so, we create space for analysis rather than defensiveness. Ethical problems surrounding authorship rarely begin with a conscious decision to act wrongly. More often, they emerge from situations that feel ordinary, familiar, and even reasonable at the time. Understanding these situations requires us to slow down and examine how ambiguity is produced. This subunit, therefore, invites you to observe patterns rather than personalities. It asks you to think about systems rather than a single moment. This perspective is essential if we want to talk meaningfully about academic integrity. In the previous subunit, we deliberately examined authorship and contribution from an idealized perspective. We temporarily set aside institution pressures, power relationships, and real-world constraints, and we constructed a simple but clear ethical model. That model defined authorship as a responsibility-based role rather than a reward, and it emphasized accountability and intellectual contribution. But once that model is in place, a natural question follows. If the ideal is so clear, why does reality drift? Why in real academic research do the boundaries of authorship become so easily blurred? In this subunit, we will not discuss specific cases, and we will not make moral judgments. Instead, we will try to understand how ambiguity becomes normalized. This shift is important. Rather than asking who is right or wrong, we are asking how certain practices come to feel normal. Ambiguity does not usually arrive as a sudden shock. It develops gradually and quietly. By tracing the process, we can better understand why ethical clarity is so difficult to sustain, even among well-intentioned researchers. The first major source of ambiguity is the role asymmetry in research relationships. In most research settings, master students, PhD students, and research assistants occupy very different institutional positions from supervisors or principal investigators. This asymmetry is often discussed in terms of power, but it also involves a asymmetric role of expectations. Students are usually expected to learn, to comply, and to accumulate experiences. Supervisors, by contrast, are expected to lead, to decide, and to evaluate. Within such structures, questioning authorship arrangement can feel inappropriate or risky. Silence in this context is easily interpreted as an arrangement. From an ethical perspective, however, this interpretation is problematic. When someone lacks meaningful freedom to choose because of their rule, we cannot simply treat their apparent arrangement as fully informed consent. The structure itself constrains what can be said and done. Even if no explicit pressure is applied, expectations embedded in rules shape behaviors. This is why rule asymmetry is such a powerful source of ambiguity. It makes ethical significant decisions appear natural and unquestioned. Even genuine consent is uncertain. The second choice of ambiguity lies in implicit norms embedded in academic culture. Many expectations about authorship are not formally taught or clearly articulated. Instead, they are learned informally through observations, limitations, and repetitions. Students often encounter unspoken rules. For example, the idea that the professor is usually listed as first author. That being listed at all is already a privilege for students. Or that authorship issues should not be raised too early. These arrangements are rarely written down, yet they strongly influence behavior. Importantly, they do not necessarily stem from bad intention. They are often inherited practices that feel normal because they are so familiar. Over time, such norms create a sense of what it stands. Over time, such norms create a sense of what is standard practice. When practice are perceived as standard, few people stop to question whether they can align with ethical ideas. This is precisely where ambiguity accumulated. Ethical reflections fades, not because people reject ethics, but because norms quietly replace principles. What feels normal gradually overrides what is ethically justified. In the third source of ambiguity comes from institutional incentives built into academic systems. In many environments, publication counts, authorship orders, and journal rankings are closely tied to promotion, funding, and career advancement. With such systems, authorship gradually shifts from a responsibility-based role to performance indicator. The meaning of authorship changes. Instead of asking who should take responsibility for the research, people begin to ask whether an authorship arrangement helps meet institutional expectations. This shift does not usually occur through explicitly rejection of ethical principles. Rather, it occurs because the system rewards certain outcomes and pressure individuals to comply. Ethical considerations are not eliminated, but they pushed into the background. Compromises begin to feel reasonable, even necessary. Ambiguity emerges not because researchers disregard ethics, but because institutional structures make it difficult to prioritize ethical clarity over measurable performance. The system itself reshapes how authorship is understood and used. The fourth source of ambiguity lies in the nature of the research process itself. Research rarely begins as a full-formed project. It develops gradually and even evolves over time. Contributions shift, responsibilities change, and projects take unexpected directions. At each small step, nothing appears seriously enough to trigger ethical concerns. A minor adjustment here, a redistribution of tasks there, a gradual change in who does what. This phenomenon often described in ethics as incremental drift. No single moment clearly cross the line. There is no obvious red flag. Yet, by the time the research is completed, the relationship between authorship and responsibility may look very different from what was originally intended. Incremental drift is particularly dangerous because it feels harmless at every stage. Each step seems too small to matter. Ethical reflection is postponed again and again until it becomes difficult to reconstruct how things change. By then, ambiguity has already solidified. When we consider those factors together, a crucial insight emerges. Authorship ambiguity is rarely the result of a single individual making bad decisions. More often, it arises from the interaction of the role asymmetry, implicit norms, institutional incentives, and incremental drifts. These factors reinforce one another. Role asymmetry disencourages questioning. Implicit norms define what feels acceptable. Institutional incentives reward certain outcomes. Incremental drift allows small changes to accumulate without notice. Within such structures, ambiguity is not accidental. It is a structurally predictable outcome. Recognizing this does not excuse unethical behavior. Rather, it helps us understand why ethical clarity is so difficult to maintain in complex research environments. This perspective shifts our focus from individual blame to structural awareness. It encourages us to ask how systems shape choices long before explicit decisions are made. Understanding these structural causes does not mean justify the outcomes. Explanation is not excuse. To understand why ambiguity arises, it's not easy to say that it should be accepted. Instead, understanding equips us with better tools for ethical judgment. When we recognize the pressures and the dynamics at work, we are less likely to oversimplify ethical problems or personalize them unnecessarily. We can see why good people may find themselves in ethical, uncomfortable positions without fully realizing how they arrived there. This kind of understanding is a prerequisite for meaningful ethical reflections. Without it, discussions about integrity risk become moralistic or detached from reality. Ethical clarity requires not only principles, but also awareness of the condition that threaten those principles. The distinction between understanding and justifying is essential. It keeps ethical analysis grounded and preserve nominative standards. If ambiguity is so easy to produce, the next question becomes unavoidable. Under those real-world conditions, what must not be closed? At this point, ethical reflection can no longer remain purely descriptive. In the final subunit, we will return to the original stories, and we will clearly identify the red lines that define the minimal standards of academic integrity in authorship and contribution. These red lines are not ideals. They are boundaries. They mark points beyond which ambiguity can no longer be tolerated. By understanding how ambiguity emerges, we are now better prepared to ask where the ethical limits must be drawn. This transition completes the movement from ideal model to structural analysis to nominative boundary setting. It prepares us to move from experimentation to judgment in a careful and principled way. End of this section.